Hi, I'm the History Guy. I have a degree in history and I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. There are many battles in history which say changed the course of a war, but there are some whose impact is actually much larger than that. There are battles so significant that they changed the course of empires for generations. Some so important that they impact events half a world away. Some that so transform our understanding of the nature of warfare that they turn all planning and prediction for the future on its head. But battles like that are usually pretty well remembered, even amongst a population generally ignorant of history. Battles that important are heavily studied and well known, but some are surprisingly forgotten, or at least forgotten outside the area in which the battle was fought. And one such battle was fought May 27th and 28th of 1905. The Battle of Tsushima is a largely obscure battle in an almost forgotten war that was overshadowed by the much larger world wars of the 20th century. And yet, the Battle of Tsushima is perhaps one of the most influential naval battles in history, and it deserves to be remembered. By the start of the 20th century, conflict between Japan and Russia in the Far East was virtually unavoidable. Both were expanding empires with competing aims. Both more and more aggressively considered Manchuria and Korea to be within their spheres of influence, and both mistrusted the other based on race. Under Tsar Nicholas II, the Far East was the focus of Russian territorial desires. Russia sent over 170,000 troops to Manchuria as part of the international intervention during the 1900 Boxer Rebellion, and after the rebellion, most of those troops remained. Russia, considered one of the world's great powers, was considerably improving its ability to move troops to the Far East with the construction of the still incomplete Trans-Siberian Railway. The Russians had leased the warm water port of Port Arthur from the Chinese and stationed a powerful naval squadron there. Although the base was largely to counter British influence in the Far East, it was seen by the Japanese as a direct threat. And Russia was negotiating timber and mineral leases on the Korean peninsula, which they increasingly saw as being their sphere of influence. At the beginning of the 19th century, Japan was still a feudal state, but the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed in 1867, and Japan embarked upon a new era that, rather than rejecting foreign influence, embraced modernization and reform. This became known as the Meiji Revolution. The word Meiji means enlightened rule, and the goal was to combine modern advances with traditional Eastern values. The Meiji period resulted in many political and economic reforms and transformed the Japanese economy and industry. But it also reformed the military, introducing not just Western weapons and tactics, but universal conscription. When combined with the cultural spirit of the samurai, Japan created a powerful, modern imperial army and navy, and a very militaristic society. As the nation grew, the leadership was keen to cultivate a sphere of influence that matched other great powers, and they, like Russia, saw it as their destiny to dominate Korea and Manchuria. Between August of 1894 and April of 1895, Japan had easily defeated China in a conflict over influence in Korea. The victory in the First Sino-Japanese War established Japan as the preeminent power in the Pacific. The conflicting interests in Manchuria and Korea made armed conflict virtually unavoidable, and while U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt tried to negotiate a peaceful solution, the Japanese eventually grew tired with the slow pace of the negotiations and in February of 1904 declared war on Russia. The Japanese launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before the Russians had even gotten word of the declaration of war. To the surprise of the West, who thought Russia the superior power, most of the actual fighting in the Russo-Japanese War favored the Japanese. The Japanese were able to first bottle up the Russian fleet in Port Arthur and eventually capture the fortress. For its part, Russia fought mostly for delay, needing time to move reinforcements across the vast Russian expanse on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was not yet fully complete. With its Pacific fleet neutralized, Russia decided to send the bulk of its large Baltic fleet to the theater. But that was no mean feat. Britain would not allow the use of the Suez Canal, and even most Russian allies, like France, were technically neutral in the conflict, and there were strict limits on what aid they could provide to a belligerent. The fleet left in August of 1904, and after an 18,000-mile journey all around the tip of Africa, was approaching Japan in May the next year. The fleet was exhausted, and morale was low after the long and difficult voyage. The plan was to make for the port of Vladivostok to join the remains of the Russian Pacific Squadron, but that required that they pass through the Sea of Japan. On May 27, 1905, the exhausted Russian ships ran into the Japanese Navy as they tried to enter the Sea of Japan through the Tsushima Strait, located midway between the Japanese island of Kyushu and the Korean peninsula. It was an uneven battle. The Russian ships were in disrepair, the crews exhausted, the decks were covered with coal for the voyage. The Japanese not only had more ships, but they were more modern, had larger caliber guns, used newer explosive rounds, and had fresh crews. The first to go down was the Russian battleship Osubaya. She was the first modern armored battleship to be sunk by gunfire alone. The Russian battleship Borodino exploded when it took a direct hit to its magazine. In the initial fight, the Russians lost a total of 4 battleships. The Japanese pressed a night attack using destroyers and torpedo boats. The Russian fleet became fragmented and several more ships were disabled. When the Japanese fleet caught up with what remained of the squadron in the morning, the Russians, realizing they were outgunned, surrendered. Only 3 Russian vessels managed to escape to Vladivostok. In the action, the Russians lost 7 battleships and 14 other ships sunk, with another 7 ships captured. While the Japanese fleet had sustained some damage, they had only lost 3 torpedo boats sunk. The lopsided victory effectively ended the war. The significant losses and increasing opposition at home forced Russia to sue for peace. Theodore Roosevelt offered to mediate, and the war officially ended with a treaty signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, September 5th of 1905. Russia agreed to vacate Manchuria and to officially recognize Korea as within the Japanese sphere of influence. Japan officially annexed Korea in 1910. For his efforts, Theodore Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Battle of Tsushima was the only decisive naval battle in history fought primarily between modern steel battleship fleets. It was the first naval battle in naval history in which radio played a critical role, and it was the last time in naval history that ships of the line of a defeated fleet surrendered on the high seas. The lopsided loss so significantly impacted Russian prestige in Europe that it impacted war planning for places like Prussia and Austro-Hungary. And while it would be an overstatement to say that the Battle of Tsushima caused the First World War, it so shifted the balance of power in Europe that it made that war much more likely. The success of the larger caliber guns of the Japanese fleet convinced the British that battleships with bigger guns were more valuable than the mixed caliber batteries that had dominated naval thinking to that point. And that would give rise to a revolution in battleship building that started with the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906. And then that would lead to a naval arms race that increased military spending in Europe by nearly 50% and greatly contributed to the militarism that would eventually lead to the First World War. The significant losses of the Russo-Japanese War were a large driver of the dissatisfaction that drove the Russian Revolution of 1905, which forced Tsar Nicholas II to make political concessions and promulgate a new constitution in 1906. And that unrest and the resulting government oppression would then drive the forces that in the Russian Revolution of 1917 would dismantle the monarchy and give rise to the Soviet Union. The lopsided Japanese victory established Japan as a world power, but also strengthened the hand of the militarists in Japan and set Japan on a path of trying to dominate all of Asia. And that would eventually set them at odds with the United States and European powers that had an interest in the Far East, like Great Britain and the Netherlands. What's more, the Japanese were dissatisfied with the terms of the Treaty of Portsmouth, and they largely blamed the United States, increasing tension between the two. Russian participation in the Far East in the Second World War was largely designed around regaining the territory and influence that was lost in the Battle of Portsmouth. And thus, the Battle of Tsushima set the stage for the Pacific conflict in the Second World War. The Battle of Tsushima not only decisively ended a conflict between great powers of the world, greatly enhancing the reputation of one and diminishing another, it changed the balance of power in Europe. It so changed understanding of military technology that it led to a worldwide naval arms race, and it set the stage for the events that would eventually bring the great powers into conflict yet again. The largely forgotten Battle of Tsushima, more than any other single event, presaged the World Wars. I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series, 5 Minutes of History, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button, which is there on your left. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for other topics for the History Guy, feel free to write those in the comment section, and I will be happy to respond. And if you'd like 5 minutes more forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.